Well, hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to the fourth session of the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets, Foundation of Economic Thought, where we will talk today about Marx and the critique of capitalism. My name is Enrique Payares, and I am the research director at the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets. Just before I introduce our speaker today, I want to remind you of a couple of logistical things, which is that we usually will go for about 90 minutes. In total, about 70 minutes will be the lecture, and then there will be a Q&A for about 20 minutes at the end. You can ask your questions in the Zoom itself, and then we'll get through all of them and have a lively discussion and a question period at the end. So joining us today is Dr. Fernando Arteaga. He's the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets academic director and a senior fellow in the economics department at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches history, the history of economic thought. And he will lead us today through the very interesting thought of Karl Marx. So Fernando, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Enrique. So let's start. Let me share the slides. Okay, can you see them? Okay, so let's start. So thank you, everyone. So today's session will be about Karl Marx and the relevance of Marxism. So this will be complemented later on Thursday by Andrzej Borenchik. So I'll skip a lot of things, and those things will be covered later on. So I'll skip most of the biography for the sake of brevity. So of course, everybody knows Marx. So this is the guy. He's a German. He was born in the 19th century. And what we need to ask ourselves is, how important was this guy for economics? How important was this guy in general? So we have the archetype, of course, that he was a very important figure for modernity. And I will bring a little bit of evidence, even if this evidence is a little bit weak in the sense that, well, how to quantify it, how important is a person, right? But nonetheless, this is kind of a perennial question that we as humans always have. So who is the most important human that has ever lived? And this is a book authored almost 10 years, more than 10 years by now. And it's basically a book that already had a past. This has a new authors. These are computer scientists. And back then, what they used to do is they look into Wikipedia and look for basically biography of people. And they said, well, how often this person are visited, how often their pages are edited, and basically how much they are referenced across Wikipedia. And they created more or less this ranking that basically provided an idea of who is the most central figure across humanity. And what you see here, of course, there are some biases. This is in English, the English Wikipedia. So there may be some bias. There is some bias for English-speaking figures and for American figures. So there's a little bit of present bias as well. So you can see George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, persons that of course are very important for the United States, but maybe they are not are relevant, say, to Europe or to Asia or so on. So of course there will always be bias. But what is relevant, of course, at the beginning we have figures like Jesus and Mohammed, and second one is Napoleon. I mean, there's a whole historical period called the Napoleonic period because of this guy. So of course we have come to acknowledge that these three persons are quite relevant in understanding the evolution of humanity. But what you can see is that the first figure that we've talked about, Aristotle, is number 8, but of course he's mostly perceived as being a philosopher. But number 14, and above Adam Smith, which Jacob and Professor Daniel Klein covered last class, Adam Smith is number 56, which is way below. I mean, obviously it's way top. I mean, it's the 56th more influential person in human history. So of course, Adam Smith is quite influential. But when we compare to Karl Marx, he's below. Now, what's interesting here, and this is something that we will be talking about, or I'll be referencing a little bit, is that he nonetheless is considered to be a philosopher rather than an economist. So something that I will try to emphasize is that at least in this period, it is very difficult to signal if what is a philosopher, what is an economist. These just are thinkers, these are intellectuals that have basically theories, that have ideas about how the world works, and they try to represent that through their work. This is another paper that more or less tries to do the same. This is the most recent one. This is focused only on economists. And here the question, of course, is basically what an economist is. And again, even though Jesus kind of talked a little bit about that in the introduction class, nonetheless, will continue referencing the idea that an economist, more or less, is a person that talks about economics. This is kind of the famous George Stigler dictum that economics is what economics is what economists do. And depending on the period, of course, the definition of what economics is changes. So back in 2000, 3000 years ago, of course, these were Greeks. These were Greek philosophers that talk a little bit about economics, which is where we draw the word economics. Then we move into fast forward a lot of time, a lot of thousand years, we look into the 17th, 18th century, and these people are philosophers are trying to understand what society is. And that's why Karl Marx is here as well. But nonetheless, what I want to emphasize is that he's way, way above. So Adam Smith is seventh, and Karl Marx is number three. So this more or less puts into perspective the idea that even if we dislike or even if we love Karl Marx, we need to acknowledge that the archetype, the idea is that he remains quite influential for the modern world. Now, there are some recent papers within economics that try to quantify what cost Marx ideas to become so relevant, because there's a lot of debate about, is Marx original? I mean, just like in general, when we think about a thinker, we think, is he really that original, or he's drawing some of his ideas from other persons from the past? Or what is the contribution of this guy? It's kind of difficult to really to causally identify if someone is new, innovative in the ideas they produce, or if they are just rehashing some old-fashioned ideas. Here is an econometric counterfactual in which basically they do this thing called synthetic control, in which basically they try to create a counterfactual Marx based on how often he cited and compared to other works, other persons that are very similar to Karl Marx. And what these authors are trying to say is that what propelled Marx to become the most important figure in our perspective from modern times really is the Russian Revolution. After the Russian Revolution, you see that there's a big spike in real Marx compared to counterfactual Marx. So counterfactual Marx is basically mostly other socialist thinkers, mostly Karl Rothbertus, which I will be referencing a little bit, which can be seen as an alternative to Marx's theory, but it's quite similar, at least in its economics. And what Magnus and Makovey state is that really is the Russian Revolution. It is after Lenin that it is the Soviet Union that makes Marx quite relevant. This is, of course, quite debated, but even some Marxian historians recognize that this may be the case. So, for example, Eric Hobsbawm, which is one of the most important historians, just historians of the 20th century, in one of his most recent books before he passed away, he wrote about the influence of Marx in the modern world. And he more or less stated that it is the Russian Revolution that propelled him. And because of that, basically Marx's ideas propelled to the rest of the world, and they became influential from Southeast Asia to Latin America to Europe to Africa. And for him, the only other person that is as relevant as Karl Marx for modernity would be Mohammed. So this is just to put into perspective how important Marx is. So once to summarize a little bit this idea, which we are covering just briefly, is that first, Marx's legacy goes way beyond what we are going to talk about in this course, which is just economics. It goes, of course, into philosophy, which most people refer to as being a philosopher, and of course, what he's really most known from, which is revolutionary politics, about the idea of socialism and the revolution as necessary. Now, what I will stress right now, but I will also stress across this class, is that for Marx, these three are linked together. You could not disentangle this. So economics, philosophy, and politics and activism, generally speaking, are entangled in his project, in his work. To him, the social scientist aspect of it is all of it. It's not just one of them. Marx is not just a philosopher. Marx is a philosopher that is also an economist, that is also a social radical. So it is all in this bundle. Now, we can also agree, more or less, I can stress this, that I can say that maybe we can agree that really it is true that Russian Revolution had a lot to do in making him one of the most influential persons in human history, as I try to stress, because it institutionalized his ideas and globalize his influence. Now, having said that, we need to stress also the fact that when we look just into his economics, he's kind of a marginal figure in mainstream economics in the 20th century. We will cover more of that in later sessions of the class because when we talk about basically a marginalist revolution in next week and the reception of marginalist economics later on, we can see that, of course, main Marxist ideas were not forgotten, but basically thought as being flawed and hence not being worthy of further pursuit, of academic pursuit. So these were marginal. So when we think about Marxism, it's not really studied in the economic departments. There are some heterodox economic departments in the US and across the world that do have some sort of Marxian economics studies, but really they are minor and they are not that influential. So even though he's this big figure, he's not really studied anymore as an economist. Now, a corollary of this discussion that I've tried to stress is there is an underlying issue that we need to think about. Is do ideas shape history or does history elevate certain ideas? And again, this is very difficult to disentangle and there's no clean clean causal identification mechanism that we can have. So as we will see in this same class, I will present that the Industrial Revolution will play a big role in having an influence in how Marx writes. And of course, nowadays, how Marx writes influence our perception of the Industrial Revolution. So in a sense, there's kind of a feedback between both ideas and history. And the same Marx, of course, had a philosophy about this. He was a materialist, and of course, he may thought that really it's not really the ideas that shape history, it's really economic structure that shapes history, and through that it shapes ideas. That's kind of a Marxian philosophy about history. But if we go beyond that interpretation, that Marxian interpretation is still quite difficult to stress who influences what. Now, one thing that I want to mention is why. Why should we study, as economists that study economics today, study Marx, if anything? Of course, there's a big opportunity cost if you are studying economics to study just Marx, but nonetheless, I would argue that there are some good things about Marx that may be useful to understand better. And it's something that perhaps it's become a little bit more common today in terms of how economics is understood. Focuses more on institutions, on how this hierarchies and inequalities matter for social structures and things like that. That's a big issue. So the focus on power and group relations, the political economy aspect of it, it is quite relevant. It's not just a production function. It's not just how capital and labor intermingle to create some product. Is that behind that production function, there's some bargaining issues between the worker and the owner of the capital. Or if you have a more detailed production function, of course, between any of those sectors. The second aspect, which is also quite relevant, is that history matters. Their analysis should be constituted in an historical manner. So this political economy, these power relations are constrained by the institutions that are historically contingent. So there's no economics in abstract. Yes, we have supply and demand, but supply and demand themselves are constrained to some institutions. So that's something that Marx emphasized. So there's also an idea of maybe exploitation. Of course, I will cover a little bit of exploitation in Marxian terms. Nowadays, we may disagree about exploitation in his own terms, but nonetheless, we are quite interested in understanding inequality. We are quite interested in understand why some groups have better bargaining positions compared to others. So that's something that, of course, Marx also has an important influence in our understanding. And a fourth one is just try to understand crisis. So this is something that's often criticized about economics. Like we always think in terms of supply and demand and achieving equilibrium. But what happens when there's no equilibrium? What happens when maybe there's some unraveling of the system into unequilibrium, a disequilibrium? So this is something that, of course, it was quite relevant. It was core aspect of Marxian economics. So for all this, I think it may be relevant to study, to have an idea of what Marx says. I've seen very often people, and here I must recognize my bias. I'm not a Marxian economist by any long chance. I don't think he was generally correct about a lot of things, but I often see people criticize Marx in wrong ways. They criticize kind of the cliche Marx, and it shows that people have not read Marx. And it's that those criticisms are quite easily dismissed because it shows that you have not read Marx, and your criticism is not really attacking his arguments or his ideas, it's just attacking his politics. And you may be right in not liking his politics, but if you are to understand his politics, you need to understand what led him to think about his politics. And that, of course, will help you to have a better critique of Marx himself. So if you like him or if you don't like him, I would say that it may be a little bit useful to study him. And this will more or less serve as an introduction of his ideas. If you want to know more, there are some references here. Before we go into exploring his ideas, nonetheless, I want to focus on a very big aspect, which is the historical context. As I stressed, this is quite relevant for Marx, so it is quite relevant for us as well. So, what is the context of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century in England that led him to think about the economic system in the way in which he thought about it? So, this is a picture about Birmingham. Birmingham became kind of the archetypical urban city of the Industrial Revolution because it grew so fast and it had a lot of basically industry. And the archetype is basically you have a lot of machinery that pollutes a lot. So this is one way to understand the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So I am, as economic historian, I am biased. If you are economist, you may be biased, in which we think the Industrial Revolution in very positive terms. Economists think actually the Industrial Revolution was very positive. When you look into the data about estimations of income per capita or even median income, you could see that before the Industrial Revolution, the world was very poor. 100 years later, after the first and second industrial revolution in the world, actually the world is quite rich nowadays. And almost all across the world, it started in England, then into Northern Europe, then into the rest of the offshoot Western societies, and then into the rest of the world. Basically, the world grew rich because of that. This is the famous hockey stick chart, in which in the Malthusian period, prior to the 18th century, everybody was poor. In the 19th, 20th century, nowadays we are rich. That does not mean that everybody is rich. In relative terms, of course, there is inequality, but nonetheless, in a historical comparison, everybody improved because of the Industrial Revolution. That's the perspective that most of economic historians would argue is the correct one. But nonetheless, there is an issue here. When we look just closely, not into comparing the 16, 15, 14th century or 2000 years ago and today. No, compare just what happened in the 19th century. Did people in the 19th century improve? And why did Marx, and not only Marx, people in the classical political economy tradition that will be covered a little bit more by Andrej, people saw that really some of these workers, these people that are working in this time in the cities, were not really enjoying quite life as much. It appeared as if they actually were worse off than they used to be. So what's the contrast between this notion of the Industrial Revolution, how it changed society, compared to this romanticization of the past, of the life before market societies, of the life before capitalism? And so, for example, we have here the Birmingham Gazette kind of describes in their own time how basically poor people lived. And it was, again, a lot of pollution. People live in very cramped spaces with a lot of dirtiness, a lot of diseases. So urbanization and the Industrial Revolution had a bleak picture. It was not the picture that now we have as an economist. This is another quote from an historian, again, Hobsbawm. Yes, he is very much influenced by Marxian himself in describing this, but nonetheless, he's a very important historian that has a quite detailed analysis of the time. And he says that in the age of the Industrial Revolution, people had workers that live in the city were drunkards because that's the only solution they found to their despair in their life. He says here, infanticide, prostitution, suicide, and mental derangement, all of them are things that were caused by the economic cataclysm that was the Industrial Revolution. Again, this is a very pretty bleak picture of the time. And he's not only an historian relating to the past. In his own time, Mark Twain, almost all of the work by Mark Twain, all the novellas, actually kind of, even though he was not socialist and he was not, he may be perceived as a social reformer, but he was no socialist. He described in his novellas how society of his time, the problems of the society of his time. His most famous novella, of course, Oliver Twist, details the life of an orphan that lives in England at the time, and he details all the bad things that are occurring, mostly because of the poor laws. Poor laws are basically some system of law that some laws that have existed in England since medieval times that had the idea of trying to basically alleviate poverty in some senses, but they were quite heavily discussed because were they doing what they were attempting to do, that is alleviate poverty? And people like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo actually said no, they actually increase poverty even more. So this is kind of a bad public policy. They had their own economic reasons. For example, Malthus, because of his own theories of the principle of populations, he said, well, actually poor laws, by trying to alleviate poverty, they increase poverty, because what they do is that they give more food to people that have less incentives to actually improve their own positions. Of course, this is kind of an oversimplification of Malthus, but nonetheless, this is quite relevant to understand the context of the time. Of course, Marx would totally disagree with Malthus, and he will disagree with Ricardo. He will attribute the poverty not to a natural instinct of the population to reproduce themselves, and because they have more food availability. No, he will say that actually for Marx, it's pretty clear that the blame has to be put on the capitalists that are exploiting. We will see a little bit of that in just a moment. But I want to stress here is that all authors kind of paint this picture of the Industrial Revolution as being not as rosy as we now see it. And of course, because of that, the only thing that may alleviate that is basically to social unrest. And it is natural to expect that living in those conditions, people will rebel. And because of that, there's an explanation of basically the arisal of socialism as a system. Eric Hobsbawm more or less stresses that basically the revolution was actually virtually compulsory, because that's the only thing that you need. That's the only thing that you have left to do. In a world such as bleak as industrial revolution, that's the only thing that you need to do. Now, this is not an economic history class, so I will not go into detail about this, but perhaps it's interesting to contrast this with the perspective that today economic historians have. So why is this contrast between the bleak picture that I just presented and the economic history itself that tells us that actually industrial revolution is not that bad? So this is a graph by Robert Allen, which is one of the foremost experts on the industrial revolution. And he actually created this paper and he coined this term called Engels post, which again refers to Engels, Friedrich Engels, in which he stresses that actually for a short period of almost 50 years, there was some sort of a stagnation in the wages, in the income of workers in England. And he basically says that from 1770 to 1830, that was true. What you see here is basically the real wage of the workers and more or less the productivity of those workers. And I find this graph quite interesting, not only for historical matters, because it resembles more or less our conceptions about what is happening today. Maybe you have seen some graph about the same idea about productivity and wages of people, and you see that starting almost 20 years ago or 15 years ago, there's kind of this gap between how much labor gets and how much productive labor is. And this is why also some authors have the whole theme of inequality has become so important as well today compared to the past. Famously, Thomas Piketty, this French economist, kind of published this also influential work by today's standards called Kapital as well, because he wanted to resemble what Marx did in his own period. He tried to understand why this is occurring, if anything. Of course, for Allen, he stresses that it only occurred until more or less 1840s. Afterwards, more or less, wages kept pace with productivity. And there's a huge historical debate about if this is the case, because depending on which series you are drawing information from, the estimations of the wage, this is true or if this is not. For example, American economic historian Gregory Clark will say that actually that's not true. It's the idea of being a pause in wages stems more from the less that some of these people like Feinstein and Allen more or less overestimate the wages prior to the Industrial Revolution, but when in the series that he has, he says that actually that's not true. The Industrial Revolution actually enabled workers to prosper as well. So there's a lot of historical debate. There's also some recent papers. Recently, economic historian Nicholas Kraft says that actually, even though wages may be stagnant, the fact is that there was a huge increase in population. So the fact that wages did not decline with the increase of population is itself very important because they maintain constant. So the income produced by society was so large that it actually enabled the workers not to decrease their income per capita because they actually were reproducing quite fast. But this is another debate. This is just another context, just to stress that this is quite relevant to understand why Marx, why socialism arose more or less in this period. And of course, and this returning to the what causes, what explains ideas history, or the history explains ideas, because our own understanding of the Industrial Revolution is pretty much influenced by Marxian thought. So this is pretty much self-reference as well. So let's move now into investigating the ideas of Marx. And I will be very brief in this regard because I will be focusing more on the economics of Marx. But of course, he started as trained as a philosopher. He had these important books. He started reading Hegel, but then he turned down the inside up the idea of dialectics. He tried to understand the material and economic conditions rather than abstract ideas are the driving force behind historical development. And he tried to stress this notion that human beings are inherently social and productive, and under market societies, workers experience alienation from their labor. This is a philosophical concept that will later on gain an economic justification as well. And here, this is just a brief pause just to stress that this is quite different from the Smithian view on market societies. If you remember last week, when Jacob and Klein presented the idea of why division of labor is beneficial for society because it enables basically productivity to grow, and that's all okay. Yes, it is true. But what Marx will say, that's the positive aspect, but there's also a negative aspect of market societies because they alienate people from what they are producing. Humans should be attached to the things that they produce. When you produce for someone else, you're detached for those things that make your life meaningful. And hence, they inhibit the human potential. And that is the whole concept of alienation. So once you are in a pin factory or in any factory, you become very good at doing one specific task. But that means that you don't have time to experience the whole umbrella of human experiences. If only what you do is basically push a button for the rest of your life, you may become quite good at pushing that button, but that means that you will not have time to read novellas, that you will not have time to do another stuff that actually is the core of what makes a human human. That's kind of the basic critique. That's important. It will be basically the core aspect of Marx's philosophy, and of course, it will influence how he later interprets that in his economics. And again, the other aspect is this dialectical condition about it is materialism. It is really the structure of society which is given by market conditions, by capitalism, that later on enforces this human condition, and hence his whole notion of historialist materialism general. So the other aspect of Marx that matters, of course, is again that's philosophy. Now we have to understand social activism. Activism, it's all tied together. He's most famous, of course, for the Communist Manifesto, but he also published a lot of other works. So, for example, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Louis Bonaparte is the nephew of Napoleon. Later on, Bonaparte became emperor himself, and he changed quite a lot of the politics of France in his own time. So quite relevant. Marx lived all those changes, how he wanted to relate what was occurring at that time. And later on, he published another influential text that was published after his own death, which is called The Critique of the Gotha Program, which later on served as kind of a foundational aspect of what today is the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which at its core, it began as a socialist party, and in which basically Marx provided the only vague blueprints of socialism. And I think this is something that I want to stress right now. In this class and in this course, we will not be talking a lot about socialism. But we're talking about Marx ideas, and what Marx brought is mostly about the criticisms of capitalism. You will not find a lot of what socialism is in Marx. Yes, he presented how we will get into there through the crisis of capitalism, but how socialism would work is not something that really Marx brought. This is something that later other economists and other philosophers brought later on in the 20th century, but not in Marx. The only brief blueprint of that is here, in which he criticized some social reformers, because of course Marx believed that the only way to achieve socialism is through revolution, is not through state reform, to public policy that will actually try to alleviate inequality, is not to poor laws, it is mostly to revolution. The workers have to seize the means of production. That's the only way. So moving on to the core aspect of today's session is why Marx turned to economics. What's the economics of Marx? So I want to stress again, even though I will focus on Capital, that's not the only work that Marx produced. He started producing and living with economics, tried to study economics at the same time that he was writing about philosophy. And he had some texts, some of them have become more relevant today. For example, the Grundrisse nowadays have become kind of a guide to try to study it as Capital nowadays. And the earliest one, where he kind of innovated in terms of trying to think about the concept of alienation and how that relates to a specific what's the wage of the laborer. It's in this text, which is called Wage, Labor, and Capital. And then he also had a lot of volumes of the theories of surplus value, which some consider to be what would come to, if he had time, this would come to be the fourth volume in Das Kapital, in which he criticized some theories of capital that are different from what he has. And again, I want to stress this. Marx saw economics not as a separate discipline, but as a continuation of his philosophical project. It's kind of the same. It's two sides of the same thing. So you have the philosophy in try to understand the social conditions, the historical materialism, and you have the economics as a scientific method to understand all of this. But you can understand one without the other. So Marx economics was an attempt again to give a scientific grounded to his earlier philosophical concerns. This is a period in which everyone is becoming secular, is become less attached to just presentive debates around ideas. They want to present the aura of I am a scientist. I want to prove things. It's more like a positivist understanding of what science is. But this is nonetheless the whole point is that this is science. This is not religion. This is not just pure ad hominems. This is not just pure idealization of things. This will come to pass, and I know because of this and that. How can he do that? He will recast again the concepts such as alienation in terms of real how people set their wages and how capitalists get their profits through surplus value, through alienation, through exploitation. He will try to recast these philosophical terms into economics. And because he was a historical materialist, he would say, well, this is all historically contingent. So economics needs to be framed in a historical pattern. And market societies, capitalism, are not natural. This is not something that basically economics cannot explain everything. Economics, as we now understand, yes, we can apply our supply and demand and utility functions and our ideas to Greek societies, and we will able to understand societies 2000s in the future. Of course, the conditions will change, but no, our understanding of economics allows to do that. For Marx, that is wrong. For Marx, the scientific way to study economics is to frame this into a historically contingent aspect. And capitalism is just one phase in human history. Just like feudalism was another, and socialism will be another. And they require different economic frameworks. So that's why also why Marx never provided a blueprint for socialism, because he had not experienced, and he said, well, this is I don't know how it works. I know it will come to pass. We will reach socialism sometime in the future, but the clear mechanics of socialism, I do not know. I know capitalism because I have experience. I know a little bit of feudalism because that's my starting point of why capitalists came to be in the first place. But I'm going to focus on capitalism. This is the core of what I'm trying to do. Of course, Marx encountered classical political economists he drew from, so he got a lot of praise and a lot of criticism of Smith and Ricardo. But for Marx, Smith was the first economist. The Wealth of Nations was the first systematic account of the capitalist system. And for him, and this is a big emphasis, for him, he introduced the labor theory of value, as we saw with Jacob and Daniel in last sessions. There's a lot of there's some people say no, actually Smith had espoused another view. It was not labor theory of value, but for Marx it was the case, and he was the first, and for that he acknowledged it quite highly. Same with Ricardo. With Ricardo, what he did is refined what was in Adam Smith in terms of this production function and how the bargaining positions between laborers and owners of capital led to a given outcome in terms of the productivity of each of them and their contribution to the pie. But nonetheless, of course, Marx would disagree in terms of how they arrive at their own conclusions, and that's why he wanted to improve upon them. But nonetheless, he ranked both Ricardo and Smith quite high. He had different things to say about Say, which Say, more or less also a political economist, a French political economist of his time, presented this idea that markets were self-regulating and harmonious, which Marx totally disagreed. So our own concept of which today is defined as the Say's law, which commonly misattributed as basically supply creates its own demand. Marx totally thinks that that is totally incorrect. The market and capitalism is not harmonious at all. Markets do not actually self-regulate. There's an inherent trait in market societies to unravel and to create crisis. So he has less charitable things to say about say compared to Ricardo and Smith. And he also didn't like Malthus quite much because of the things that I previously espoused in terms of Malthus on population theory stress that the wages of persons kind of became basically were approach these subsistence wages, which came to be because the self inherent traits of humans to reproduce rather than to save, for example, and because of that they became poor. So this is kind of a demographic explanation of why people continue to be poor. And Marx totally denied that, said no, there's nothing inherent in humanity that makes people or laborers poor. It's all about the system, the economic system, and it's about capitalism, market society. So Marx totally disagreed with Malthus. And John Stuart Mill, which became kind of the last major figure in classical political economy, which Marx saw as a very interesting guy because Mill acknowledged some of the issues with market societies, and Stuart Mill himself tried to present those issues in market societies. It was not the whole rosy picture that maybe Adam Smith presented, but for Marx, Mill lacked the theoretical concepts to actually explain why this was bad. So that's more or less the framework on which Marx is working. So everything that I will present in just a moment needs to be understood in the context of what these other guys are talking about. Now, I will go very fast into this because, again, there are some socialists or some social reformers before Marx. These are more or less what we can consider the utopian socialists, and they are utopian because they are not scientific in the sense that Marx wants to create an apparatus that is rigorous and explains how capitalism works. Another most, I would say, for what we are covering here, more relevant authors are people that dealt into economics. Most importantly, it would be Rodbertus, Lasalle, and a little bit Hodgkin. Hodgkin is quite relevant because this guy, even though he's considered a socialist, he's also sometimes considered a free marketeer. So if you remember, there was a question in last session of Dan Klein. Someone asked if there were some people that actually took Adam Smith, and from that they argue in favor of the working class. So this will be one of those guys. And he was more like, yes, I like free markets, but nonetheless, I think profit and rent are actually exploitative. So depending on who you ask, he's a classical liberal or he's a socialist. So quite an interesting guy in itself. Rodbertus is another very interesting guy because he dealt in economics. He basically, I will talk if I have time later on about von Baberg, which is one of the most important economists that criticized Marx. And in his early works, von Baberg actually thinks that Rodbertus had the best theory of capital based on exploitation. It was not Marx, it was this guy. So, and later on, von Baberg will make a critique to Marx himself, but nonetheless, this is a pretty important guy in itself because he dealt with economics. Then we have Ferdinand Lassalle, which another important social reformer because he became quite close to the Prussian government and as a founder more or less of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, a pretty influential socialist. But what Lassalle and Rodbertus have in common is that they believed that the state could be reformed. A revolution was not necessary. And this is where Marx vehemently disagreed. And of course, we have Proudhon, which is famous or infamous for his debates with Marx about the philosophy of poverty and the poverty of philosophy and so on. So there is a chart here where there's more details. I don't have time to explain more about this, but these are other socialists. So again, what I'm trying to say is Marx maybe special, but he's not the only one that's thinking. I mean, the context of the Industrial Revolution and the bleakness of the picture that I presented early on applies to a lot of people, and a lot of authors are trying to study what's happening. Now, let's move into the core aspect of today's session, which is Das Kapital. And first, then we need to look into what's the motivation about why Marx is doing this. And again, this is something I'm stressing quite a lot, but this is so very important, I think, that Marx cannot disentangle his philosophy from his economics. And these are bundled each together. And this is why he wants to do Das Kapital. Just as Adam Smith brought the Wealth of Nations as a complement to the theory of moral sentiments, Karl Marx is writing Das Kapital as a complement of his earlier philosophical work. And what he wanted to do with the Das Kapital, he wanted to present a criticism of the political economy of his time, and at the same time present his own systematic account of the capitalist system. He wanted to lay bare the economic law of motion and modern society. So this is the kind of the earliest publication of Das Kapital, and this is the one modern one that I think was published last year in English. This, of course, the original is in German, and this was published, I think, just last year. This is just to stress that there's still new editions being published, new translations about Das Kapital. That speaks about how important this guy is. And translations are relevant. I don't have a lot of time to speak about this, but there's a lot of debates within Marxists about basically how translations may mess up his own work. For example, also historically speaking, the first translation is into Russian. So maybe there's a causality there between the Russian Revolution because they were the first to receive it. The Tsarists actually approved the publication in Russian because they thought that Marx was quite convoluted and nobody would read it. Of course, they were pretty wrong. Then French is also quite interesting because he himself kind of revised the edition. And some Marxians would argue that the version of Marx that we should read is not just the German Capital, but it should be the French one as well, because there are some a little bit of differences. And another one that is quite interesting is Japanese, because there's a whole Japanese tradition of Marxism that is non-Western. And through that, also the Chinese got a little bit of that. So the Chinese translated mostly from Russian and Japanese. So I do not know a lot about the Japanese tradition of Marxism, but there's this. It exists and it is quite relevant. Even today, you go to some economic departments in Japan, and there will be some that study Marx. So that's just to speak that it is quite relevant. So some translations here. I don't have time. Now, another thing that I want to stress is that within his own lifetime, Marx only published the first volume. This is relevant again because for further interpretations of what Karl Marx meant need to be interpreted from what he wrote and he published in his own lifetime and later editions done by other people. Engels, most famously, kind of published later on volume 2 and volume 3. There are some Marxians that argue that only volume 1 is the one that you should read because there's he's the one that's the one that was published. There are some that says that we should read 1 and 3. There are some people who said, well, we need to read the whole opus. And of course, there's the fourth volume that again, some people believe that the theories of surplus value is that one, and this was published more later on. Now, let's look closely into Marxian political economy. So I want to stress a little bit about this is my particular interpretation based on an interpretative framework. This is not the only one. This is the one that I favor. And I think it's the most relevant. So this guy here is Duncan Foley. He's a emeritus professor of economics at the New School of Social Research, and I think is one of the most important Marxist economic thinkers in the 20th century. And he wrote this book called Understanding Capital. It's a very slim book. He's trained as an economist, and he later on become a Marxist. And because he was trained as a modern economist with the modern techniques, he wanted to provide a guide to Das Kapital that did not require, that was more favorable to a modern economics student. That's the way, to an undergrad level. So this is more or less at an undergrad level. Later on, we will see that there are some other Marxian economists that also formalize a little bit Marx, but in more for a graduate level. So you can also see kind of the same things that occur within regular economics occur within Marxian economics. But for now, let's just stress that this is my own interpretation based on this book. So if you want to refer to this book, this is kind of the core of what I will be presenting. The first one, and I will go briefly here, is that it starts also from Adam Smith. So there's a differentiation between use value and exchange value. And not only Adam Smith, this goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle also makes the difference between basically how much you value something because you want to use it. And in a bilateral exchange, you can also exchange things. But in a market system, how you use money also matters. And exchanging things for money is a different framework, requires a different framework. So there's this difference between use value and exchange value. And they have, of course, labor. Marx espoused the labor theory of value, which more or less tells us that newly produced commodities contain the total productive social labor time. And this is quite relevant because there are some people will criticize Marx's labor theory of value, stressing it is obvious that labor does not instill value in things, because if I work 100 hours in a thing, I will not get more money selling that thing. So for example, retaking some previous example of the pencil that in early sessions we have covered, a pencil requires a quite convoluted nexus of sellers and buyers in order to be produced, because you need wood, you need a lot of things to produce the pencil. If I were to do that by myself, I will require a lot of time because I will need to get the wood, the graphite, and so on. So I will have, I don't know, I will spend 1,000 hours. But my pencil will not be selling according to me spending 1,000 hours. And Marx agrees because he says what you spend alone individually in labor hours will not get you, will not fetch you a price that is commensurate to the value of that, because the value is not what you individually put in labor. It depends on the total productive social labor. I will explain more in this example. This example, again, this is an example that I take from Duncan Foley's book. And we kind of estimate, this is not technically GDP, but we can see them as GDP in an economy is 3 trillion. So we know that there are 100 million persons, and we more or less can stress that one person works 40 hours per week for 50 weeks. So more or less 2,000 hours per year. So how much hours per year? It will be more or less, we'll multiply 2,000 hours, multiplying 100 million, it gets us 200 billion. And we divide between the GDP, and that gets you more or less that each hour of labor creates $15 in value added. So some sense is a little bit tautological. That's how a lot of economists have criticized kind of this whole framework. Nonetheless, is different. So the labor theory here more or less espouses that this is the social labor time. We need to consider everybody. It's not just you. So if there's an industry that creates pencils, what gives value to that pencil is not what you individually spend making that pencil. It's basically the average labor time. And it depends on the whole system. And this is how Foley interprets Marx and how Marx more or less solves these potential criticisms that labor actually does not provide value. They said, yes, it does. Look into this. Now, at the core of this, of course, there's a presumption of how we should deal with labor. And this is thoroughly emphasized in Marx theories. What they stress is that labor is abstract. So it's not concrete. I'm not talking about a guy that makes a pencil. I'm not talking about a carpenter that makes furniture. I'm not talking about someone specific. This is abstract. Labor stripped of its specific form. It's also simple. So it can be measured. And this is kind of the common denominator in units of average unskilled labor. We're not talking about a guy that's very adept at doing things. We're talking about the average guy that does not know how to do anything. So it's simple and abstract, but it's also social because this is performed to sell in the market. And because it's performed to sell in the market, it needs to consider basically what everybody else is doing. And it's also necessary, and I will explain more about this in just a moment, because there's a subsistence wage. There's a subsistence level at which basically the capitalist cannot, there are some specific conditions. I will explain a little bit more about what necessary implies for Marxian model in just a moment. But there are some contingencies, some constraints that we need to be aware. And it could be measured through value, which again is a socially necessary labor time that is expressed in some Marxians that think that there's monetary theory in Marx. For Foley, for this interpretative framework, there it is, and it much depends on calculus like this. There is some. This is kind of a brief example, but this can be formalized, and in fact, a lot of the formalization of the 20th century has come to. This is kind of an example of that. You can do kind of a general equilibrium theory about the whole system. Uh, so each commodity has labor and it has a price, the money it sells for. Now, what's interesting again is that individual prices may not reflect value because we're talking about the whole system. This is the Marxian labor theory of value works as a whole system, not individual. We have an example here. So we want to make a table. It requires $200 in inputs. That means it's constant capital that already exists. And it requires 20 hours of labor. As we previously established, 1 hour is more or less $15. And that leads us to more or less that the production, 20 multiplying 15, is $300. So technically speaking, the value of the table should be $500 because it's 300 in labor plus 200 in terms of the inputs that the table already had. But that does not mean that the table will be sold, will be selling by 500. It could be sold at 400 or 700. So what Marx is stressing here, and this is kind of one of the big differences with respect to marginalist or modern economics, is that for Marx, there's no interest in attempting to explain how prices work in the market as a whole. What he's interested is in understanding how the social relations of work and capital are done and why the capitalist or the capital owner, the one that actually controls the means of production, actually gets its own profit. It's not about trying to understand how prices work. Prices can vary because of bargaining power differences, information asymmetries. There are many things, and Marx would agree on that. There are prices sometimes may differ from value, but as a whole, because of the system is done through this framework, they always match as a whole, not individually. So the labor theory of value, the Marxian labor theory of value, explains how labor becomes expressed in money even when market forces distort individual prices. There's also a discussion here in Marx about simple circuit. Simple circuit is kind of what Aristotle will term kind of a normal usage of I produce and I sell And this is a bilateral exchange. I have a commodity and you have something that I want from you, and I have something that you want from me, and we exchange. This is exchanging for the sake of use value. This is exchanging for the sake I want to use what you have and you want to use what I have. Here, the aim is not profit. There's no surplus. This is not market. Well, there's an exchange, but there is no market. But there's a market. There's a market system as a whole. This is a different circuit. Here, we do not start with the commodity that we use money to exchange for another. Here, we start with money, we invest, and we put that money into a production process that requires commodities, which I mean that you have capital plus labor power. They transform to a production process that gives you a new commodity, which later on is sold and gets you more money, which is basically the money that you used to have, which is your initial investment, plus the profit. Here, you get more money than you originally had. Here, the circuit, the capitalist, the market exchange circuit, not in a bilateral exchange, but in a market exchange, is not consumption based, but profit driven. And it repeats itself indefinitely. This is also why, when in the first session, when we talk about Aquinas and Aristotle, there are some historians of economic thought that some say that both Aristotle and even Aquinas can be perceived as precursors of modern economics, but also of the labor theory of value. Because you can interpret this Marxian framework also in terms of Aristotle, because they are kind of relating to the same idea. One thing is bilateral exchange, and one thing is market exchange, and they have different frameworks to be studied, to be understood. Now, the key thing is that labor is what gives value to things, and it's used in production to produce more value than it costs. The excess value, the profit, is surplus value and is the source of profit in the capitalist systems. So here there's also a difference in terms of labor power and labor in Marx. Labor power is basically what the capitalist actually pays to the worker, and labor is what he actually does. There's a difference because Marx needs to explain that there's a gap between labor power and labor, and this is where the surplus value comes from, that goes to the capitalist and it's taken away from the worker. The rate of surplus values, hence, is how much surplus capitalists gain relative what the workers reserves in wages. So there's also the part that I like the most in Das Kapital is really not these theoretical arguments, but some historical evidence that he provides. I mean, I don't think he's right, but he produces quite an interesting narrative about the idea of the original or primitive accumulation, in which he starts to say how capitalists in the very first place came to be owners of the means of production. And he talks about how historically, basically, the passing from feudalism to capitalism, where workers were freed from feudal or slave-like obligations, and hence they were blessed in some sense because they were no longer tied to the land. They were free to move, but because of that, they were also dispossessed of the land, and hence they had to work in order to make a living. So they have to sell their own work in a city, and they have to be alienated. So this kind of both a blessing and a curse. In some senses, I would say Marx agrees that capitalism is kind of better than feudalism, but still not ideal. And he has an economic history of this. This is kind of a quote of that. And because of lack of time, I will skip this, but I will present this is kind of the theoretical basis of Marx. So here what you have is a social working day. In a social working day, what you have is that sometimes you work not for the market. So if you go to your house and you clean your house, you're not being paid for that. So that's labor that you do that's not paid. That's non-wage labor. Then you have to go to the market because you need to feed yourself and you are not producing your own food. You need to buy that. So you need to go to the market and receive some wage. That's the wage labor. Now, wage labor is also divided between what you get paid and what you not get paid. What you get paid, again, wage is what gives value to the things. So there's a division between what you produce is different to what you receive. You produce more than you receive. You receive wages, but the other part that you are producing as a laborer is the profits that the capitalist gets. And that's also the surplus labor. Now, necessary labor here, I told you that I was coming back to here, is basically everything else that's labor that actually supports the system. Because again, non-wage labor is also necessary. Once you go to your home, you need to cook for yourself. That's labor. It's necessary for you to subsist, but that's not been paid, but that's necessary. What Marx will stress is that what the capitalists or the owners of the means of production will want to do is basically try to extract as much surplus as possible. How they do that is through these concepts called absolute and relative surplus labor, which meant that they will try to extend the working day. So if you work 8 hours, they want you to work 9 hours. That means that they will extract more surplus from you. But what they would also like to do is to reduce the pay that you receive. So it's through extending the working day and through reducing how much they are able to pay you, reducing the necessary labor very much. That's how the capitalists actually operate. Now, here again, this is something that I want to stress. Marx emphasizes that reproduction is central to understanding capitalist society. It is through these repeated cycles of wage, labor, and commodity exchange that class structure is perpetuated. Now, there are some other concepts. I will talk about them briefly. Is that there's kind of also a kind of prisoner's dilemma game here between capitalists themselves. Labor is what gives value to the stuff that's being produced. But because they want to extract so much of it, they want to actually create more capital. They want to introduce more machines. They innovate through having more machines because that will save cost to them. But because of that, they actually also reduce the amount of value that they are producing. They are fighting, the capitals are fighting between each other. That creates that as time passes, there are less and less capitalists that accumulate more and more. The capitalists that are able to extract more from their workers are the ones that are more successful, and they take the businesses out of the unsuccessful one. That's why more or less Marx believed that there was kind of this tendency to concentration and centralization, in which this concept of the reserve army of labor plays a role. Because for Marx, technological innovation, which in classical political economy terms, technological innovation is not really technology in the way in which we perceive it nowadays. It's mostly the use of more capital. So more machineries, more capital. It's just having more capital rather than more labor. It displaces labor and it creates this set of people that would work for less and less because there are a lot of workers in unemployed. The subsistence wage of the person will be low and low, and that will allow the capitalists to actually extract more surplus from these persons. But there's a contradiction here, according to Marx, because again, this will mean that they will create less and less value. So the average rate of profit in the whole system tends to decline over time, and that is what creates kind of crisis. So there are some examples here about this, but just to end my the conceptualization is that this is what brings the final crisis of capitalism. That's what would bring. So capital becomes concentrated and centralized, generating large monopolies with vast power. There's a big reserve army of labor, and worker conditions worsen through time. Capital accumulation requires more exploitation, widening inequality, and more social division because capitalists are fighting each other. But the rate of profit is declining. So they are asking for more, but the rate of profit is declining because less and less people are working. So, but at the ultimate crisis is political. At the end, an organized, class-conscious proletariat sees the reins in production. And here is where basically his economics and his philosophy and his social activism tie together. This is where he thought that socialism will come to be. Now, I will stop here just because we don't have any more time. But there are some, just to mention briefly, there are some Marxians after Marx. Marx, for example, just talk about a closed system. It was a closed economy. So what happens when there are open economies? So, for example, Rosa Luxemburg talk about actually capitalism requires non-capitalist societies to sell their things. That's how one way to explain colonization. Hilferding here, an Austro-Marxian, he actually increased the labor of banks, how banks actually work. They thought that he exemplified with that banks take profit out of the capitalism. So there's not only a fight between capitalists, but also between banks and capitalists, and so on. So there are some other modern, so for example, here Michio Morishima is a Japanese economist that formalized Marxian for modern economics at the, I would say, at the grad level. So it has a high level formalization of that. Paul Sweezy is kind of a Keynesian. He worked in the 60s. He kind of denied the labor theory a little bit, but he presented that most of Marx's ideas were correct. So he kind of popularized Marxian economics in the US. There are some books, and there are some other authors here that are relevant more or less today. These are kind of what I consider to be the most important Marxian economists today that work in economics, not in philosophy. They have different views. For example, John Robert would espouse very different views that most Marxians would actually disagree, but nonetheless, they themselves consider to be a little bit of Marxians. So with that, I don't have time to talk about the criticisms, but there are a lot of criticisms to Marx, from classical economists to modern criticisms. So thank you, and let's open the ground for questions.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for that great exposition of Marx. There's a bunch of questions here that we should start getting through. So Alfred Kusan first asks about Marx's influence, and wonders if he was more influential in sociology than in economics.
Yeah, I would say that nowadays, okay, nobody, I mean, only few departments of economics actually study Marx. I studied my undergrad in one of those, and I would say every public university in Latin America and maybe South Asia, maybe in China, I don't know, in China has studies that, but in regular mainstream departments, as the ones that are typical in Europe and the United States, yeah, he's not really that influential. But in philosophy, and in social science in general, I would say that he is quite influential. And I will bet that if someone asks about a regular layman people about Marx, they would have an idea, a vague idea about what Marx tells us about socialism, about the crisis of capitalism.
Yeah, that's great. Also, somebody asks for you to expand a little bit on why Marxist theories are considered flaws per mainstream economics, which I get flawed. I mean, which I guess are related to this point that they're not really studied in mainstream departments.
So yeah, this goes back to a topic that I did not talk about, the major criticisms of Marx, as first espoused by Wicksteed and von Baberg, I would say, in which they went deep into the economics, and they talk about some inconsistencies and some alternatives ways to explain how profit works. At the end of the day, the economics here tries to understand how income is created and how income is distributed across the different, basically, sectors. Why workers receive a wage, why owners of the land receive a rent, and why capitalists receive a profit. The Marxian theory exposes the idea that only labor provides value, hence everything else is just exploitation. What the alternative theories by Wicksteed and other marginalist thinkers will say is that actually that's not the main theory. That's not even the most simple theory. There are other theories. Even Piers Rafa and Neo Ricardian, Ricardo himself will say that actually that's a radicalization that has no merit at all. So marginalist thinkers that there are other theories that explain better. So for example, preference, intertemporal preference, profit could be just a payoff to how much you want to save compared to how much you actually want to borrow, things like that. How much you value your present compared to your future, how much, things like that. There are better ways. Also, labor theory, as I stress in the talk, has no attempt to explain how individual prices are formed, which again is something that is very at the core of price theory, which is how we study economics. So there's a clear divergence between Marxian economists and non-Marxian economists because of that. And because of that, most Marxian economists dismiss this kind of theory. They tell, actually, we're not interested in understanding why this piece of bread actually cost $5. I don't care. What I care is about the system as a whole. And the labor theory of value gives a framework to how profit and how wage is set up in the system.
Yeah, that's great. I will jump a little bit here because there's a question that is related to this by Marcelo Collado, who asks, he says, Marx died in 1883, 12 years after the beginning of the marginalist revolution led by Menger and Jevons and Walras. Marx's theory of value was based on the labor theory of value, developed by the classical economists. And he asks, why do you think Marx apparently wrote nothing about the marginalist revolution? And did he realize that the marginalist utility theory of value would replace the labor theory of value? Basically, he's asking if you know whether Marx was aware of the marginalist revolution in any way, and if so, how?
So yeah, he was a little bit aware, but same thing I just talk about is that for him, marginalist economics were attempting to solve a problem that was not an issue for him. So again, Marx was not interested in understanding how prices are set up in the economy. He did not care about why a piece of bread was priced in the way in which it was priced. He was okay actually at taking more or less the idea that supply and demand more or less are the core aspects of how the price system in the economy works. But that's not scientific for him. The science aspect of his theory was evaluating the system as a whole. And for him, the labor theory of value is essential. So you cannot disentangle that. And for the non for the marginalist economics, actually, that's not necessary. It's just subjective. We do not care about how value is embedded in a thing. We do not think in terms of exchange and use value. We only think in use value, and we express everything through bargaining positions or through supply and demand. How the constraints between the supplier and the demander. But we do not care about anything else, and that created again a disjointed, a different kind of a, a, um, a different way by which Marxians and non-Marxians thought about economics. And that is why, again, I think most Marxians do not think highly of marginalist economics, because for them that's not economics. I mean, it's the same for mainstream economists. We do not think that labor theory is economics. It's kind of a tautological, obscure artifact of the past that is not simple. But we are speaking different languages. That's what I'm stressing about, and that is what creates kind of the issue. It's not that Marx was not aware. It's not that other Marxian economists are not aware. It's just that they think that mainstream economics does not go to the core of what makes economics scientific.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And then um, somebody asks also about the book Anti-Marx by Juan Ramón Rayo. If you know this book and if this literature review is a good representation of his economic thought, or is it more of a straw man? Do you know this work, and do you have anything to say about it yet?
So I have not read it. So I know that it exists. I don't know if it's published in English actually, but I know it was published last year or 2 years ago or something like that. It's quite recent by an Spanish economist, Rayo. And from what I know and the brief things that I've looked into it, it's a pretty good representation of what a marginalist economists would think about a Marxian system. And this is also why it's kind of dismissed by the Marxians. Because I'm not going to the details here, but again, this is what I think it creates kind of the obstacle between Marxians and non-Marxians, on Marxians and marginalist economists or mainstream economists today, is that we are speaking at different levels. So some Marxians actually would agree that there may be some inconsistencies. This is something that I would have covered if I had more time in the presentation, but there are some Marxians that actually talk internal criticisms of Marx in which they expose that there are some inconsistencies in the Marxian framework about how, as a whole, the system equiparates basically value corresponds to price, and this is called the transformation problem and things like that. And there's a lot of discussions about that, but these are internal criticisms that they take valid. They say they are valid because they are internal to how they think about it. But once you start to think in terms of other ways to think about economics, they disagree. They think labor theory works as a way to represent the philosophical apparatus about exploitation. So that is also why I kind of stress in the talk. You For some interpretations, I would say for Marx himself, it's impossible to disentangle the bundle that Marx, as a philosopher, as an economist, and as a social activist is. And this is where kind of the problem of anti-Rayo also, anti-Marx, sorry. I think he mentioned anti-Marx or anti-Rayo because I think there's also another response to Rayo that is called
Anti-rayo.
Rayo or something like that. There's kind of a debate in Spanish about this. But again, what I'm stressing here is that there's a disconnection between the language, between the Rayo or the marginalist thinkers and the no and the Marxians.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, well, let's jump to another question that I think is a little bit related to this, because you just mentioned, Marx's theory of exploitation, and somebody just asked if you could elaborate a little bit on that, on the theory of exploitation, which seems to be one of the most influential aspects of Marxism. How have his critics responded to this theory specifically? And also, did Marx address the exploitation of labor not only through wage labor, but also through unpaid domestic or private labor?
So yeah, well, exploitation goes back to the idea that you work. Work is the only thing. The profit that the owner of capital receives goes from the labor that is not paying wages to you. So that's surplus labor, and that is exploitation. Basically, that's the exploitation. He's not paying you what you are creating. That's the exploitative part. Now, for some of these criticisms, again, you mentioned one, and this is kind of a within the Marxist tradition, they are kind of a feminist and ecological perspective that I'm not an expert on. Well, I'm not an expert on Marx, but there are some within that tradition that criticize Marx for not making an effort to go beyond just exploitation to the worker. For others, there's exploitation more than just the worker. It's not just about economics, it's about exploitation of the women, for example, because historically women has been the one that has done the most unpaid labor in the household, and this does not go to the market. In a pure Marxian interpretation, as exposed by Marx, that is not exploitation because there's no market interaction and hence there's nothing. But for some other Marxists have expounded that there's some patriarchy here that there's exploitative even if it does not go to the market. So just for example, another example of improvements or modifications of the Marxian system, the most famous one is of course Lenin. For Marx, the whole system makes sense internally because of the things that I've just stressed. You need to have workers that are displaced. The people that are displaced from land, they become workers, they sell their work, and they are paid less than they produce. And there's a deterioration in their standard of living that leads to a crisis because of the overexploitation of the system, because that's the logic of the capitalist system that leads to a revolution that creates socialism. That's Marx.
Mhm.
But when you look into Lenin and the justification for the Russian Revolution, there's nothing in Russia that actually makes sense in Marxian sense. For Russia, in times of Lenin, in terms of the Tsars, there was no urbanization, there was no capitalist system. They were all basically serfs still. They were in a system prior to capitalism. They were in serfdom. They were in feudalism. For Marx, that would have been impossible. First you would need to be a capitalist, and then you would need to be a socialist. But Lenin had to justify how to make a revolution, not from a capitalist system, from a feudalist system. Again, there are many of these things in writers after Marx that criticize Marx because maybe you could say that their situation does not apply to the Marxian system, and they want to use the Marxian philosophy but not the economics part of it to justify their own social activism, and they try to modify it. And the unpaid labor by the women, for example, is one of them. I can say that maybe he would disagree about that. He would say no, actually, that's not something else to the markets. So that's not exploitation in his own system. That does not mean that there is not kind of an oppression, but it's not exploitation in the Marxian framework.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you. There's the next question by Alfred Kusan is about more of the historical circumstance, and he asks, wouldn't rising life expectancy in England in 1848 to 1900 be a more accurate measure of conditions than Nick Dickens' novels? And he asks, didn't the life expectancy raise about 10 years during that period?
Yeah, I would agree. I would totally agree. Now, what I want to point is that sometimes there is a disconnection between what we are experiencing and what we how we interpret it. I mean, even in our own lifetimes. I mean, this is common to say that we are never aware of our golden years. We only know that the golden years existed because we saw them in retrospective. Like we wish we were 10, we were 20, we were 20, we were kids. When we were kids, we were happy. Something similar happens in societies, I would say. There's a kind of a lot of debate about why not only Marx but a lot of political economists had some sort of a negative view of the economic conditions in their own time, and at least they were not seeing the things that we think we see now in retrospective, that they were experiencing a lot of positive changes in their own lifetime. Something similar may occur to us right now in terms of how we debate economic growth, like what has been the effect of the internet or things like that. In pure economic terms, technically speaking, there has not been a huge increase in GDP because of the internet, even though we may think about it. So I mean, this is kind of a philosophical question itself. How do we perceive reality? And I don't know. I don't know the answer. I know it's important. I acknowledge that that's interesting, but that's it.
Okay. Then somebody asks about the difference between liberals and those anarchists and whether or not it was a class issue. What are the relationships between classical liberalism and the social pro-market anarchists?
So I think he's referring to when I talk about Hosking, but within his own time, within the time of Industrial Revolution, there were many people that, given that they saw that the conditions were changing, they thought that the best policy to follow was different, either to follow strict free markets or to regulate a little bit more or to do some tweaking on tweaking. I mean, even within socialists, as I stress. So, for example, Marx was one that would have actually liked for free markets to actually exist. Why? Because that will exacerbate the problems of capitalism of oppression. He was thoroughly against social reformers such as Lassalle and other guys that even though they themselves were socialists, they wanted to reform the state in order to improve the conditions of the population. And Marx would say, no, actually, we need a revolution because only through socialism we will change the structure. The reforms will only change a little bit, will alleviate a little bit, but not enough. And they will not change the core conditions, the structural conditions of the system. We need to change the system. Also, there are some like, I don't know, Bakunin, which I did not talk.
Yeah.
Bakunin was an anarchist from the left that criticized Marx in his own lifetime. They were both members of the International, where basically people from same leftist background get together and discuss. And Bakunin would argue that actually the socialism that Marx espoused was itself totalitarian. It was not just a logic of workers against capital owners, but oppression existed at different levels. And the state, if there's a state, there will be oppression, no matter who owns the state. So for Bakunin, for example, if socialism came to be, then the oppressors would become the workers, which technically speaking would not be workers because we will be the owners of the state. So in a sense, you can criticize the Soviet Union through a left anarchist Bakunin sense as well. So people like Hoskin believe in free market because they believe that actually bilateral exchanges were actually good, but sometimes market exchanges through the logic of the market were exploitative. And so again, this goes back to the philosophical um, structure of each thinker. So for example, I don't know if you're aware, but current libertarians, I would say, sometimes argue that banking itself is exploitative, banking today, because what's the business of banking? What the bankers do is basically they lend money and they borrow money, and they use the money that they borrow from depositors to lend that money. They never have kind of 100% reserve in the system. So that's why financial crises sometimes seem to occur, because when a panic occurs, you go and want to retrieve your money, but bank does not have all the money that you lend it to him, to it. So that means that panic occurs and the system unravels. And that's some libertarians from the right or from the liberal tradition actually criticize that, because said that actually this is theft because the property should be, because I am entrusting you to actually have money in the system, but I'm trusting you the whole 100%. So it should be a 100% reserve system. So this is just to stress that sometimes there are differences in how we conceive what property is and what's legal and what's not legal, and that also modify our own intuition about what is actually justified in a market and was not justified in a market. And that more or less tells the story of what sometimes a classical liberal may be confused with a socialist, like Hodgkin.
That's great. Thank you. Maybe this is a good time to ask this one too. Somebody asks if the formula of the initial investment plus the surplus value doesn't overlook the velocity of money.
There's some there are some people that would say yes, that there's no monetary theory in Marx. If I had more time, I would have gone a little bit more into some of the formalizations. So Foley himself, I think, has a dynamic model of how this works. And more or less in his system, he proves that velocity itself is regulated a little bit, not a little bit, totally by this. So it does in a general equilibrium and dynamic model. Basically, Marx was right as well. But yeah, there are some criticisms levied on Marx based on the idea that if this were a static model, he would be incorrect because of that's one of them. There are other criticisms. The rejoinder by Foley and others is that once you make this model dynamic, actually the whole value of money changes because as I stress in the slides, for Marx, the value of money itself derives from the social labor time in an economy.
Great, great. Well, we're running out of time here, but we'll try to get through the last couple of questions.
I have no issue going more. I mean, I
Okay.
can respond to everyone.
Okay, great. So I'll give you a kind of quicker one first, maybe, which is if you have any suggestions for biographies about Marx that you could recommend. Um,
That's an interesting. Well, actually, no, I have not read any concise biography of Marx that I remember of. I sorry, I don't have anyone. I know. I think the thing is that I've seen that some people bias themselves when they look into the biography because I know that Marx was not a good person in some regards. He actually had an affair with his maid, things like that. And I'm not aware of a good objective biography that looks into these aspects. If you are, this is what you're asking.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Then Michael Phillip asks, there's a couple of people that still have some questions about the labor theory. And Michael Phillip asks, how would Aristotle and Aquinas' view of labor differ from Marx's view of labor?
Well, this is an interesting question, and this is something that, depending who you ask, they will actually respond you different things. There are some people that actually stress that Aristotle was a precursor of Marx or a
Mhm.
precursor of labor theory, because in the Nicomachean even though Aristotle was interested in not in really in a scientific understanding of economics or of exchange, he was more or less more attuned to the idea of how to justify how exchanges work and if you are justifying to receiving or selling or what's the price, is it just or is not. Nonetheless, the whole idea was that Aristotle made a differentiation between bilateral exchange and consuming for the sake of and exchanging for the sake of consuming, which is something that Aristotle defended pretty much, and he made a difference with respect to the framework in which you produce to actually make a profit. Later on, Aquinas and scholastics and the School of Salamanca will deal a little bit about how is profit just. Are you justified to make a profit or not? If you are not in the simple circuit as described by Marx, and if you are in the capitalist circuit and you are actually producing merchandises, commodities for the sake of selling them and getting more money in order to then invest more and get more money and so on, are you justified to make a profit? And there are some medieval scholars that would argue that yes, and there's some interpretation. I mean, basically, what Jesus presented is kind of a marginalist interpretation of scholastic thinking in terms of, or medieval thinking in terms of, these guys are precursors of the law of supply and the law of demand. Yes, there's some acknowledgments that transportation costs matter, but there's also some acknowledgement that individual subjective preferences matter in setting the price, and that sets the demand. So, for example, I think not Aquinas, but Albertus Magnus kind of talks about utility. I think it's the first mention of utility, like as a concept. So same as what we talk about utility functions nowadays. So he already does. So that's a marginalized interpretation. But there are some other scholars that think in terms of, this guy also preceded the political economy of labor theory of value, as Marx, as David Ricardo, and Sam Smith. So this is a debate. I would say both Marx and the marginalists would say that they are influenced by Aquinas and by Aristotle. They both are. Again, this is the issue with when we go into the past. Things are a little bit more vague, so we need to interpret them, and how we interpret is our understanding of the issue.
Yeah, great. Alejandro Fuenmayor asks, an interesting question. He says, is Kant's categorical imperative framework to value human beings an inspiration for Marx's theory of value? Because I think he is deriving the value of work as the value of a person. Therefore, anything short of that value is exploitation that violates the categorical imperative.
That's also an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm able to respond that. I read Kant a long time ago and I have an idea about it, but I'm also not well versed in Marxian philosophy. Even though I've stressed that Marxian is a philosopher and an economist at the same time, my research, if you want to say that, is mostly about economics. So I'm not sure if there's kind of influence there. I don't know if Marx. I mean, I would bet he read Marx. Hey, Marx read Kant, but I don't know what he thought about it, and I don't know if it was an influence. I don't know if you, Enrique, could actually answer that one.
Yeah, no, no. I think you kind of touched on it when you were talking about Aristotle and Aquinas too, because it is part of Marx's tradition, and Kant was a part of Marx's influences as well. And I think Marx definitely seems concerned with the sort of dignity of people when he's thinking about
Yeah,
exploitation
yeah.
and things like this. The question is whether or not his solution achieves the purposes of that he sets out to achieve. But I think you've sort of covered it in many ways already. Um, Great. Let's go to the next one. Somebody asks, previously you mentioned Marx is often criticized by people who have not read his works. What is, in your opinion, one of those common points of criticism that misunderstands what Marx is trying to say?
So within economics, I mentioned it, which is criticizing labor theory of value by making this ridicule argument that if I spend 100 hours, that should be worthy more in the market, and that's not the way. As I explained in the slides in the presentation, that's not the way at all in which Marx thinks about how labor theory value works. This is in terms of economics. In terms of his social activism, I think there's often this phrase, I think is in the critique of program of Kota, in which Marx stresses that from his labor to each of to his needs, and people understand that he's thinking in terms of today that we should become a communist, but we are already in a system which pays laborers according to his labor. And that's not the case at all. For Marx, actually, he defined socialism as paying according to the labor. So he believed that in capitalism, people is not paid according to the labor. So the exploitation, again, stems from the fact that laborers are exploited. So the misconception here is attributing what for Marx would be applying to socialism. Uh, they are People often think that he thinks that of capitalism, which again is not the case. This is a misapprehension of his whole work. He believes that capitalism is exploitative because laborers, people, are not paid what they actually producing. Later on, after socialism has come to an end, then you would get a more utopic system where basically, if you have a need, it was basically the post in a post-growth era, in which basically we are not post-scarcity era, in which we no longer constrained by scarcity, we have availability of everything, then we will consume everything, and that's communism. But his criticism is that people are being exploited because they are not being paid what they are producing. That's kind of
Yeah.
another misapprehension of Marx. I don't know. I think those two are kind of the most common bad misunderstandings in Marx in general layman terms. Because I mean they go back to quick and easy phrases that Marx stress talk about, not really about reading his work.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe this is related to that, but somebody asks, how do you think that Marxist views influence post-colonial economic development in the post-colonial societies, especially in Asia and Africa?
So in terms of like public policy or in terms of the intellectuals that talk, in terms of the intellectuals that talk about it, there's a lot of it. I mean, we know because a lot of heterodox economics go into that, and a lot of social science that is not economics goes into that. I would say that that's also why there's a difference between there's a gap in terms of economics as a discipline compared to other social sciences, because other social sciences, even though they may not be themselves embedded into a Marxian framework, they are very much influenced by it. And hence they think in terms of post-colonialism and how exploitation, even though they do not have not read the economics framework or do not agree with it, they nonetheless they have this there's kind of some sort of exploitation, there's some sort of extraction of surplus at some level, and that's what influenced a lot of these thinkers in geography, in sociology. There are many guys that I actually did not talk about because I honestly do not have them in high esteem. I don't know, people like David Harvey. People think they are very famous. You go into Barnes and Noble or any library and you will find some of the books. But I think they are Marxians, but they are considered to be kind of post-colonial thinkers. They're very much influenced by Marx, but I do not have any high esteem. That's why I don't talk about them. In terms of influence, in terms of the development itself, it's kind of an even more interesting question. And I'm not sure. And it goes back to my early question about, do ideas influence economic or history, or history influence ideas? I mean, yes, Marx influenced through the Russian Revolution, as I started pointing out, influenced how the rest of the world thought about development. So yeah, the world was divided between the first and the second world, and the third world was the underdeveloped. But the second world war were the Soviets. So the third world originally was applied to the ones that did not align either to the US or to the Soviet Union. So the whole 20th century can be perceived as being influenced by a Marxian framework.
Very interesting. Um, and Argeno Prat Quevedo asks, socialists prior to Marx and Engels, non-Marxists, have historically been disparaged by Marxist thinkers, labeled pejoratively as utopians. Today, couldn't we say that these pre-Marxian thinkers had a more realistic political vision as reformers of the capitalist system, rather than Marx and Engels as revolutionaries?
So I would tend to say no, actually. And that's not to say that Marx was correct, but this may be talked more with in the next session by Andrzej. But my answer to this is that the criticisms levied by Marx is that they were idealistic. When like Robert Owen and people like that, they thought in terms of there are no personal incentives. There's just we only need to explain people how a better system can be achieved and should be achieved. And once we explain to them that we should all share and be positive and grab our hands, we can all share and we cooperate instead of compete. And that's not how the world works. I mean, that's not how. That's why I stress a little bit in the beginning why maybe we should be reading Marx today, because he was one of the first economists that thought in terms of political economy in modern understanding, in terms of the personal incentives that agents follow. So you have an incentive to follow. There's sometimes a bad equilibriums, suboptimal equilibriums, and that's maybe what how we sometimes explain these issues. It's not like we can just go and assume that these issues do not exist. They exist. We need to deal with that. There will be disagreements between individuals. Utopian socialists mostly thought that people were good And when I said they were good, it's basically they, as long as they are rational, they will be able to see that a better system can be achieved, and because once they see it, they will all cooperate. And that's not how the world works. So that's why I think that in that regard, Marx was correct.
Very interesting. Well, we have one more question about. I think you already answered about the labor theory, and then one final one that asks, why is there an apparent chasm between the revolutionary political interpretation of Marx's body of work and the interpretation of this very same work only as a new lens to understand the economic context of his time? Basically, the two different interpretations, the political and the economic interpretation of Marx. And Felipe Olivera, who asked this, he says, did Marx address this himself at the time? Was he aware of these sort of differences in the interpretation of his work, and did he address it at all or no?
So I'm not sure I agree with the assumption of the presupposition of the question, because I think that I would say that there's a complementarity in Marx's own work between his social activism, his philosophy, and his economics. That's what he's tried to do. Maybe today, from our own point of view, if you're a philosopher, you mostly read the Communist Manifesto, German ideology, things like that, and you do not read Das Capital because you do not care about understanding these issues. And if you're an economist, today's world, well, you do not read Marx at all because you
Mm,
think he's wrong. And so our own interpretative framework more or less focuses on one aspect, one area of his work. But I would say that for himself, he saw this as a whole project. I mean, this is
mm,
kind of the same as what was being stressed in last session with Adam Smith. Today, Adam Smith is very much famous for the World of Nations, but he thought that the theory of moral sentiments was his main work.
mhm,
And even though there are some people that say that there's this disparity between both works, he himself thought that they were complementary. They were talking about the same idea. I would say the same is with Marx. I would say a lot of people, especially, I mean, maybe not the other marginalist economists, but until now, these persons saw themselves as intellectuals. They were interested in understanding the system, and everything that actually allowed them to understand the system was valid. So yeah, sometimes you had to go more in depth into a specific subfield or a specific aspect of the system, but that does not mean that you wanted to preclude from the other view. These are complementary. You both need the marks of the German ideology and the marks of the Das Kapital in order to understand his framework. And I think now, again, maybe another way in which this has diverged in modern times is because post-Marxist thinkers wanting to apply Marxian thinking into social activism had to make changes. Just the example of Lenin. He could not apply everything out of Marx. Why? Because Russia was not Germany or England. Russia did not experience an industrial revolution. Same with Mao. I mean, in China, even more than in Russia, everybody was a peasant. So how can you do a workers' revolution when all your population is peasant and you basically don't have even cities? Same,
mhm.
there are different contexts. Marxism become globalized, become influenced, but it had to transform itself, and because of that, there was a specialization in the works, and because of that, sometimes differences between different interpretative frameworks arose, and because of that, maybe there's a divergence between Marx the revolutionary and Marx the philosopher. But again, I want to end this by saying that I think for Marx there was no divergence.
That's great, Fernando. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, and thank you everybody to all the participants. And we'll meet everybody again Thursday at the same time, right? For Andres Varenic's, he'll continue talking about Marx and all the further details and the philosophical details of his theories.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Take care.